Cloud. And we'll begin with prayer. So the Lord be with you.
Also with you.
Let us pray. Almighty God, we give you thanks for the gift of the evangelist Mark, who gives us a portrait of Jesus as one of having authority over not just this realm, but the spiritual realm as well. He gives us a vision of your Christ, who invites us to go deeper and to recognize the hidden truths of his ministry. Pour out your Spirit over us gathered here tonight, that we too may dive deeper into the gospel, into a greater understanding and appreciation of the works of not just Mark, but of your Son, our Savior, Jesus Christ, in whom all our prayers are acceptable. Amen.
Amen.
So I can't quite see all of you, and I'm going to shift you on my computer at least over to another screen. So if you have a question, if you could put it in the chat, I'll bring the chat up so it's visible to me. But in the meantime, if you wouldn't mind, I'm going to request you guys all mute just so we have a little bit clearer audio, and we'll get on with the show, as it were. So I have to, of course, show everybody our fancy animation. So tonight is the Rebel, and as I apologized earlier, we're not going to develop the Rebel thing too much. I promise with Matthew next week, get into Mark's title. But here are our goals. I know they look short, but there's a lot of meat on these bones. So first, we're just going to kind of invite your reflection on the Gospel of Mark. Homework, of course, is always optional, but for those of you who did respond positively to the invitation to read the Gospel of Mark, what did you think of it? So we're going to ask that question. I kind of gave you some of the clues in the letter, the introduction to the Gospel of Mark last week, but together we're going to go through and kind of sift through some of the clues as to where and when Mark was writing to his community. And then we're going to ask two very important questions. Who are we? This is a question that is kind of meant on multiple levels. One, who are we as the original audience of Mark's gospel? Who are we as heirs to Mark's community? But where are we in the story? And to help answer that question, we're going to take a look. Marianne Tolbert was a theologian who has a fascinating way to look at the parable of the sower as the key to understanding Mark's gospel. We're also going to ask the question, who is Jesus? So remember, this is a class that is trying its best to answer the question, who was Jesus, and why perhaps do our four evangelists answer that question in a slightly different way? To do that, we're going to take a look at two places in particular. The first is that middle section, which I kind of asked you to kind of pay special attention to. It's bookended by two stories of healing of blind men. And the second is, and maybe this will be our opening reflection question, and I'll invite you guys to unmute and share your reflection. Did you notice how many times throughout the gospel Jesus places a premium on secrecy? How many times does Jesus say, don't tell anybody either about this miracle or about who I am? But with that, I'll kind of invite you guys as you want, just kind of unmute yourselves. And what did you think of the gospel? And what was it like reading a gospel, either start to finish or at least in a much larger chunk than we're accustomed to in our liturgical practice of reading, somewhere 6 to 15 verses on a Sunday?
It was just miracle after miracle after miracle.
Mm-hmm. I wish I had written it down. I think Mark uses the term "and then" 86 times. It's one of the reasons why Mark is sometimes called the most, or the least developed author of the four Gospels. If you've ever met a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old, you know that their favorite transition is "and then." And then we went to the store, and then we got ice cream, and then a bird came and ate my ice cream, and then, and then. That's Mark's favorite transition. And yeah, the first 7 chapters, Jesus is moving. So couldn't agree more with you, Mike. Thanks for sharing. Any other kind of reactions? Karen, yeah. Just feel free to just kind of unmute yourself and talk. If we talk over ourselves, we'll rock, paper, scissors for who goes first.
Okay, I was just going to say it was very inconsistent. And
How
it made
so?
me, well, some he said, don't tell anyone, and some he said, tell everyone. And I didn't understand the inconsistency or the reason. It didn't seem to be a reason for it. So it was a little confusing.
Do you remember the scene where Jesus says, "Tell everybody"?
Am I making that up? I don't know. No, I can't recall it.
Okay.
No, you're not
Taking
making
note
it
of
up.
it.
You're not making it up, Karen.
Okay, I just remember taking note that, oh, now they're not supposed to, and now they are. And
Yeah.
I was just curious about it.
I think what may be happening is Jesus doesn't have a problem with being an evangelist, with kind of sharing news of the kingdom of God, but it's the question of Jesus's identity that is often kind of has a shroud of secrecy around it. So yeah, that doesn't mean to say that Jesus didn't want to teach and preach, right? And part of what we're going to see is Jesus was teaching to huge crowds of people. So not to say that it didn't happen, I can't remember it off the top of my head, but I think one potential explanation is there are things that Jesus wants shared far and wide, but when it comes to his identity as the Son of God, that's where we're going to keep the secret.
Yeah, because he does tell people to go to the temple and to offer Thanksgiving and
Yeah, so yeah,
things like
when he heals the leper, absolutely.
Yeah.
Go show yourself to the priests, make an offering, and go is now a no longer defiled person in the eyes of the temple. Absolutely.
Do you think that's,
I like the fact that when he spoke in parables, because if he just said, do this, do that, do the other, but when he speaks in parables, you can almost see yourself in that situation, or you could see how things develop. And it kind of sticks with me better listening to a parable than someone just throwing out laws.
Thanks, Mitch. So
I
John,
got the sense that Jesus wanted to do his work and get on with it. He didn't want to be a rock star. He didn't want to get buried in an entourage, which he did.
Mhm.
But he just wanted to be able to heal a person and have them understand what they had now, and make themselves right with the authorities, i.e., as Karen said, go to the temple and make the proper offering for healing, et cetera, et cetera. He didn't want it spread far and wide because he wasn't a revival show. Exactly. He was a preacher. He was a teacher, but he wasn't a revivalist. He didn't want to fill a stadium. He wanted to work with people almost one-on-one. He rarely got to, but that's another argument altogether.
Yeah, and so we're going to see in just a little bit and again, this is drawn heavily from Marianne Tolbert's interpretation, but I endorse it wholeheartedly. I think what we're going to see in the parable of the sower is an expectation that those crowds would not be around for much longer.
Yeah.
And we'll get to that. So
the other thing that struck me, I'm sorry, who did I step on? I apologize.
I have a sore toe, John. Yeah, sorry, John. What I was going to say is, I think Jesus was out there to do spread the word. I think that I don't see why he wanted to hide a little light under a bush basket or whatever he used to say. That's all. He needed to get the word out. And personally, I would rather he would have come out straightforward and said what he wanted to say instead of these parables, because I mean, it would have been much easier for me. That makes me study too hard.
Well, and Jesus is going to say, so the first parable is the parable of the sower. And there's kind of there's two stages, right? There's what he says to the crowd, which is just the parable. And then he takes his disciples and says, you guys know why I speak and why I talk in parables? It's so that they'll hear but not understand, right? These parables are a mystery. So
I'd like to say that I found Mark's writing to be very journalistic. And
What?
journalistic, like a journalist,
Yes, yeah.
like, more like he's making a report.
Mhm.
A
And,
police report.
and he seems to highlight the things that are visible to everyone, like leprosy being cured. That's different than somebody saying that they see better or that now they can hear. That's something that's visible and evidential. And it just seems to me like he's much less emotional in his presentation. It seems more that he's actually just reporting on the events.
thank you, Heather. Yeah, so just monitoring the chat, there's some questions about what version we're reading. Just so you know, I usually pull all of my quotes. The version I'm referencing is the NRSV, the New Revised Standard Version. I think any translation works, and if you wanted to hang out afterwards, we can talk about some of the varying motivations behind different versions. Some are meant to be easy to read, some are meant to be academic, and will retain difficult passages to show fidelity to the original language, whether it's Hebrew or Greek. So yeah, so we can talk about translations maybe after class. I don't have a problem with any of the versions, so it's whatever one is most helpful to you, but we can talk about it afterwards. And I use the NRSV just so everybody is clear, because that's the version that's usually authorized for use in our worship services. So, great. Well, thank you, Paul. Oh yeah, sorry, go ahead. Oh, hey, Lucinda.
So I found the place where Jesus told people to go home to thy friends and tell them how great things the Lord hath done for thee and hath had compassion on thee. Excuse me. The part that I don't get is what was going on. Something about swine in the ocean and the ship
Oh,
and the spirits.
The Gerasene
I
demoniac.
totally don't get what that was about.
That's one of the most tragic losses of bacon in the entire.
and ribs and pork.
Yeah. To answer your question, Sherry, it's a really raw story. There's Jesus has traveled, obviously. If there's pig herds or swine herds, we're no longer in Jewish territory, he's in Gentile territory. And there's a man living amongst the tombs with a demon, and he asks the demon for his name, and he says Legion, which many people believe is not his name, but a reference to the number of demons, like a Roman legion of 500 troops. Jesus doesn't want to destroy them, so he sends all of the demons into this swineherd, and they run down the side of the hill and into the Sea of Galilee up on the kind of northeast side. So that's the context for that one, yeah. And it totally, when you think about subsistence farming and what Jesus just did, having a entire swineherd of that number run themselves into the sea. I mean, that's someone's livelihood that just literally ran off a cliff. So
if they ran off the cliff?
And they said, go away and don't come back.
Yeah,
They
no, they're terrified of Jesus's power. Yeah,
You just
Gentiles.
ruined.
Of all the things to tell people not to talk about, that one seems kind of strange.
What I was concerned about that was they keep on taking all these evil spirits. Now, the boy, it sounded more like epilepsy.
Yep.
But all these people who would, had all these evil spirits and demons. I mean, did they not recognize what the illnesses were, or were they all full of demons in those days?
I think, medical science has obviously advanced, but I think as Episcopalians, we are predisposed to being very nervous about questions about the presence of demons and evil spirits. What I try my best to do is to recognize that Jesus takes them seriously. And so because Jesus takes them seriously, I don't think we could or can or should dismiss it as, well, that was probably epilepsy, because in Mark 7, there's a father who comes pleading to Jesus. He's obviously tried asked the disciples beforehand to exorcise this demon. And yeah, the symptoms to us sound very familiar as epilepsy. It's an interesting conversation, but my default is, if Jesus understood that malady to have a spiritual dimension, then we can too. And I think that the backup to that is the healing of the paralytic, right? We don't know what medical condition started that, but the cure for Jesus was spiritual. Go, your sins are forgiven. That's what leads the paralytic to rise up and walk again. So I think there are some of these demonic possessions sound to our modern ears like epilepsy, or a stutter. Some of them, well, no, it's that story too, talking about unbinding his tongue. But Jesus puts it in a spiritual dimension. So I would caution us to avoid not taking that seriously, at least for a moment. So.
What's fascinating is that the demons recognized Jesus for who he was.
Yes, good point.
So it's sort of like a satanic recognition,
And that's exactly what the Pharisees, their default position is, well, Jesus is also of that kind of evil realm. And that's where, his response is, no, a house divided against itself can't stand. I'm not of the evil dimension. I have to be from its polar opposite. So, all right. Well,
disciples don't seem to recognize who Jesus is.
Who doesn't? Sorry, David.
But even the disciples don't seem to understand who Jesus is.
No, not at all. And we're going to spend a lot of our time tonight on that exact point. So, all right. Well, thank you guys. I'm going to pull up a map here and kind of walk us through some of the clues about where we think Mark was written. So there's a couple of theories as to where Mark was writing his gospel. There's Alexandria, which is, of course, a home to a tremendous library in the lifetime of Jesus. There's Syria, and then there's Rome. We can talk about why these are kind of our theories. Basically, we don't think it was written in the Holy Land because Mark gets his geography wrong. Mark is talking about Jesus crisscrossing around Galilee. It would be something like saying Jesus headed north from Reading and found his way to Sacramento, right? That's not where Sacramento is relative to Reading, right? So it's someone largely either outside or unfamiliar with the geography of the Holy Land, which is going to limit Syria immediately. Another is the presence of Latinisms. Mark is going to use, you ever heard of Spanglish? You can imagine the same thing happening between Latin and Greek. Mark is using Latin words morphed into Greek, which shows that he's probably a native Latin speaker. We saw 2 weeks ago in our gospel reading in church that Mark has to explain Jewish customs. So he's probably writing to a Gentile audience. He has to translate Aramaic, which kind of immediately you can see Syria kind of drops off the map there. Syria is a Aramaic speaking region, and so it would not make sense for Mark to translate something in Aramaic. As I said earlier, he gets his geography mixed up, and he's emphasizing the trials that his followers will face. And for that, we kind of drop Alexandria off the list of potential places where Mark was writing. There really is no history during any of the first century of persecution of Christians in and around Alexandria in the first century. And so our attention turns to Rome. So in addition to those textual clues that kind of point, and I don't say it's absolutely, I'm I think humble enough to recognize that we're not going to know this stuff perfectly, so all we can do is deal in the realm of likelihoods. But in addition to some of these textual clues pointing towards Rome, there are also some intra and extra biblical clues. So what do I mean by that? Well, Peter writes, "Your sister, the church in Babylon," which we know from Revelation is often a code word for Rome, "sends you greetings, as does my young Mark." So this is where we start to see the tradition of Mark being a follower and maybe the scribe of Peter. Peter is in his epistle says, "Hey, the church in Rome and my young Mark say hello." Papias, a bishop in Asia Minor, writing about maybe 130 or so, describes Mark as Peter's interpreter. Excuse me, Mark is Peter's interpreter. Papias writes, "Mark had not heard the Lord, nor been a follower of his, but later of Peter. So Mark did no wrong in writing down every single thing just as he recalled them, for he had one purpose only, to omit nothing of what he has heard and to state nothing falsely." This kind of gets us into a clue of why our gospels are different lengths. Papias here is responding to, why is Mark's gospel so short? And Papias is defending him, saying, listen, he wrote down every single thing he heard of, but there obviously not every story got to Peter and Mark's ear. So it kind of gives us some clue as to how these gospels were formulated, because many of us believe that the gospels were written in the first or second generation of Christianity. So Christian tradition recounts that Peter and Paul were both martyred around the year 65. And that is part of the round of persecutions under Emperor Nero following the Great Fire of 64. So again, Nero blames the fire on the followers of Christus, which is one of those Latinisms. They're taking the name Christ, forcing it into Latin, and it comes out Christus. But it was clearly aimed at this new sect of Christians. So it is likely to take place after Mark isn't going to write his gospel before the year 65. And we also have a kind of end date that we need to get to, because copies of Mark's gospel have to be made, which is of course being copied by hand, and they have to travel and be distributed in such a way that Luke and Matthew get them in time to write their gospels. They're kind of, we date Matthew and Luke, they're kind of happening on parallel but independent tracks. Somewhere between the years 70 and 85 is when we date those two gospels. And so Mark needs to be written in that kind of 65 to early 70s to fit with all of our clues as to when and where and to whom Mark was writing. So, and I think, what I really want to highlight tonight is the trauma of the Roman persecution in Mark's community. It is inescapable for Mark's community to experience their following Jesus from their persecution at the hands of the Romans. So Mark's gospel, I think, is an attempt not only to share the story of Jesus, but also to explain the consequences of following Jesus, to kind of either motivate them or reassure them that God has not abandoned them, and that these persecutions are signs of faithfulness, not of following the wrong God. I really think that that's part of Mark's motivation here.
Which is why we have Jesus saying, my God, why have you forsaken me," on the cross.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Father David. Yeah, and we're going to talk more about why, of all the Good Friday, of all the Good Friday accounts, why Mark's is the most bleak. I mean, it absolutely, there is no good news on Good Friday. So I think it's Mark's Jesus more than any that shows survivors of this trauma how to find meaning in the midst of suffering, as well as explain the rationale of those who left the church, right? Because not every Christian held on to their Christian faith throughout the entire persecution. There's going to be scores of people who, when it hits the fan, they say, "I'm out of here, guys. I'm going to go follow some God that doesn't get me killed." So I'm going to go back to sharing. And so this is, a painting. I'm sorry, I forgot to write down the artist behind it. But this shows Roman centurions coming in, rounding up Christians in some sort of what we think of like a house church, or perhaps if you kind of look in the corner over here, perhaps preparing Christians to go out into the to be sacrificed or martyred. I just forgot the name of the Colosseum. There we go. 4 years of high school Latin, I knew it would come to me. So it's either opening up to a street or to the Colosseum. But we've got naked children being torn from their families, lovers saying goodbye. This is not a happy-go-lucky, this isn't coffee hour at a Sierra Deanery church, okay? This is, our faith has led us to perhaps make us risk our lives. So it's a very bleak time in the life of the church. So I'm going to pause there. Any questions, or maybe put them into chat about why we're dating Mark to sometime after the Roman persecution of Christians? Does that theory seem to make sense? Do the clues kind of fall into place a little bit? Okay.
Good.
So start over.
Am I on? Sorry.
Yeah.
If Mark was written first, why isn't it Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John?
We're going to talk about that next week, but the short answer is Matthew is the best bridge from the Old Testament to the New Testament. So Matthew is the gospel that is continually saying, remember what happened in the Old Testament, remember scripture saying this. And so because Matthew keeps casting its rod back into the Old Testament for clues as to who Jesus is, that's why it's first, is because it makes the most natural progression from the writings of the Hebrew Bible into the New Testament. So yeah, great question.
Which is another reason I noticed that there was almost a complete lack of genealogical information in Mark. Almost anywhere else, especially if they're writing to Jews, They're saying, well, this person is the son of that one, is the son of that one, is the son of that one, and therefore he has this kind of authority to say what he's saying. That's all missing, or mostly missing, in Mark. And
That's completely
again,
missing.
you just get, as you said, what Mark saw, what he heard.
Yeah, and so I'll kind of throw a grenade into the Zoom room and then watch it frag, because I don't plan on following up with this, but we can talk about it afterwards. In Mark's gospel, and only in Mark's gospel, is it possible to look at the baptism of Jesus and ask the question, is this confirmation or revelation? That did Jesus know his identity as the Son of God before his baptism, where the heavens open up and a voice says, "You are my son," which infers a direct communication between the divine and Jesus. In Matthew and Luke, you get the more third person, "This is my son," so everybody else gets to hear what's going on. Yeah, not only do we not know Jesus' genealogy in Mark, you could make a debate as to whether or not Jesus is the adopted son of God at his baptism. But for that, I'm going to close that theory and walk away for an hour, and then we'll come back to it if you haven't. So, all right. So I think when we talked about our reflections, we talked about Mark shows Jesus on a roll. But more than that, he shows Jesus right from the get-go as having power. So the very first thing, and I can't remember who mentioned it, but talking about the presence of evil spirits, the first miracle that Jesus performs in the Gospel of Mark is nothing else than an exorcism. And it's this exorcism, it's this display of power over evil spirits that gives everybody a heads up as to Jesus is someone to take seriously. Mark writes, they were all amazed and they kept asking one another, "What is this? A new teaching with authority? He commands even the unclean spirits and they obey him." And at once his fame began to spread throughout the surrounding region of Galilee. And so what I see in the first 7 chapters of Mark is nothing but displays of power, right? Jesus is showing again and again all of these miracles. Jesus has power over unclean spirits, over bodily infirmities, over the weather. He can he can feed 5,000 based on just a few loaves of bread. So Jesus is incredibly powerful. And the more we learn about how powerful Jesus is, the more popular Jesus becomes, right? By the end of the first day in Galilee, right, the entire town is crushing in on Simon Peter's mother-in-law's home. People are desperate for this healing, and Jesus shows compassion to the crowds. The first half of Mark's story is the demonstration of Jesus's power, and it's not just over sickness. He feeds thousands with a single armful of food. He walks on water. He stills a storm. He takes upon himself the prerogative usually reserved for God alone to forgive sins and wrongdoing that crippled a man. And so at issue in all of this is nothing else but power. Power over the elements, power over illness, power perhaps greater than any emperor and any nation. Because the thing to remember is, we are now dealing with Caesar Augustus in Rome. The emperors of Rome are not mortal men, but gods. And everyone in the Roman Empire, with the small exception of the Jewish people, are required to worship the emperor as a living god. And so if Jesus is more powerful and has a authority in the spiritual realm, perhaps this Jesus is even more powerful than the emperor of Rome. That's kind of the implication of where we're going. And as I said before, people are drawn to this incredible, miraculous power. And all through these first 7 chapters, Mark is going to remind us about these massive crowds that are gathering around Jesus and his reputation, which is growing and growing, like much to the chagrin of the Pharisees, right? I mean, they're just constantly like, hey, you people are sinning, your folks are eating with unclean hands, just because Jesus is popular with the crowds doesn't make him popular with the powers that be. I, of course, missed it. I was born decades too late. But the image we get in Mark is nothing short of Beatlemania in Galilee, right? So here's a crowd waiting for the Beatles outside of, I think, Melbourne in 1964. And when you read Mark's gospel, this is the kind of sea of humanity that perhaps you imagine. This is how big the crowds were. This is why Jesus has to get into a boat to teach, because if he was on the street, they couldn't hear him. So just acoustically, the crowds are so big that we're forced to use technology in its form and in its day to spread this context. But immediately we have to ask the question, how did things go from this to this? How can we move from an image of Jesus being an insanely popular and powerful preacher and healer in Judea to his followers being rounded up, persecuted, and killed in Rome? How do we make that transition? How does the gospel explain just how far the fortunes of Christians can fall? And so for that, I would like to offer the parable of the sower as the key to understanding not just how the crowds will react to Jesus, but as a blueprint for how the rest of the Gospel of Mark will play out. So again, by the start of chapter 4, these crowds are so big, Jesus needs to teach from a boat just so everybody can hear. And this is what he says. He says, listen, a sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seed fell on the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Other seed fell on the rocky ground where it did not have much soil, and it sprang up quickly since it had no depth of soil. And when the sun rose, it was scorched, and since it had no root, it withered away. Other seed fell among the thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it, and it yielded no grain. Other seed fell on the good soil and brought forth grain, growing up and increasing and yielding 30, 60, and 100-fold. And he said, let anyone with ears to hear listen. Now, we've got a problem because we have close to 2,000 years of Christian interpretation standing between us and when Jesus first offered this parable. And as I said, as we were gathering, Jesus doesn't offer the second half of the parable where he explains the allegory to the crowd. So if you were one of these folks just kind of like, I'm going to see what that Jesus fellow has to say today, and you heard the parable of the sower, what would you think? Right? Like, okay, so a guy sowed some seed, and some of it he wasn't a farmer, because he's not just throwing the seed on the good ground, he's throwing it everywhere. Would the crowd actually understand? And I think we can kind of make the guess is probably not, because Jesus is immediately after this going to say, yeah, I speak in parables so people don't get it, right? The understanding of parables is a gift which is not meant for everybody. I'm speaking in code every now and then. So what would they think of this parable? And maybe what did it mean? So given our introductions last week, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that you have heard at least 3 to 4 sermons on the parable of the sower in your life. I'm going to ask for a thumbs up to see if that's marginally true. Okay. I'm also going to guess that every sermon you've heard about the parable of the sower is going to fall into 2 camps. The first camp is that the parable is about us as people, that we need to be better soil. Okay, how many of you have ever heard a sermon talking about that? That the parable of the sower means we need to be better at hearing the word and being better soil so that the word can grow in us. Have we ever heard a sermon to that effect? Okay. Now, the other most likely sermon you've heard on the parable of the sower is about the sower, that it's a parable about God and the grace of the sower spreading seed wherever, not really caring about potential waste, but scattering seed indiscriminately in the hopes that it will grow somewhere at some place. So anybody ever heard a sermon on that side of the coin? Okay, perfect. I want to suggest something else. And again, I'm stealing from Marianne Tolbert. What if Jesus knew that these Beatlemania crowds were at their absolute high water mark? More than that, what if Jesus suspected that the crowds following him were following him for the wrong reason? What if this parable could explain the entire rest of the gospel? And so I'm going to screen share one more time. So my wife loves a good chart, right? So this is where we are at the parable of the sower. We've got a huge crowd represented by this green grass. We've got a lot of people, right? So when it comes to the explanation, the seed sown on the path, when they hear, Satan immediately comes and takes away the word that is sown in them. These are people who are not there. They're not responding even out of curiosity to Jesus. This is likely the Pharisees, as a group just completely opposed to Jesus from the beginning. But the rest of the crowd that have gathered at the sea to hear Jesus preach, I think represent the rocky ground, the thorns, and the good soil. And what's going to happen to the crowds is they're going to thin, because when they hear the word, they immediately receive it with joy, but they have no root and endure only for a while. Then when trouble or persecution arises on account of the word, immediately they fall away. Or maybe it's the cares of the world and the lure of wealth and the desire for other things to come in and choke the world, and it yields nothing. Jesus, I think, is predicting that these huge crowds are going to diminish. And that's okay, because the good soil, when they hear the word and accept it, bear fruit 30, 60, and 100-fold, right? And so what Jesus is saying is where we are headed is actually towards more desolation rather than more growth. That the followers of Jesus are actually about to diminish rather than increase. More than that, what if these types of soil represent not just types of people, but actually individuals in the Gospel of Mark? So the path is the Pharisees, right? They hear the word, it's immediately taken from them. But here's where I think Marianne Tolbert shows her genius. Anybody remember what nickname Jesus gives Simon right before offering this parable? What do we now call
Rock, right?
Barry, I think you had a guess.
Yeah, rock. Peter means rock, basically.
Peter.
Yeah.
Now, in other gospels like Matthew, that's going to be a great thing. Peter is bedrock. We're going to build a church on this. In Mark, in the parable of the sower, listen to how Jesus describes this. But they hear the word, they immediately receive it with joy, but they have no root and endure for a while. Then when trouble or persecution arises on account of the word, they immediately fall away. What does Peter the Rock do on Maundy, Thursday night? What happens to Peter?
He denies Christ.
Because trouble and persecution are right there for the taking. What we're going to see in the next kind of chapter tonight of my thesis is Peter is going to respond wonderfully. He is going to respond with the divine revelation that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. He's going to immediately receive this with joy. But Jesus knows that Peter is rocky soil. He knows, and this is the clue, that Peter is going to fall away when trouble or persecution are on the horizon. And Peter plays his part to a T. There's other folks, Pilate, I think, being chief among them, that represent the thorns, the cares of the world, the lure of wealth, and the desire for other things. The young rich man is another great example of this. Jesus invites a rich man, sell all your possessions and follow me. And he can't do it. The lure of wealth is too strong. The good soil, ironically, isn't the core set of actors, it's the outsiders. It's the marginalized and the poor, the recipients of Jesus' ministry, that seem to be the best soil and the ones who actually respond positively to the word. Now, this, of course, has a parallel meaning in explaining what is happening in Mark's community in Rome, right? The church used to be really big. You know, Peter and Paul are operating, you know, as probably as early as probably like the year 53. So they're operating in and around Rome for a good 10 years. You got to imagine that at the kind of hub of the world, the church was pretty sizable. But give it 10 years and start some persecution, and suddenly we see fewer and fewer people identifying as Christians. Some of us fell away, right? When they saw Timmy executed in the Colosseum, I'm out, right? Other people, perhaps they didn't respond to Peter and Paul's call to share their wealth with magnanimity. And so they left the church, right? We also have to explain the remnant that is part of Mark's community, part of the good soil, with the hope that the people who stayed, the people who endured, the people who didn't let the lure of the world distract or dissuade them from Jesus, eventually they are going to bear fruit 30, 60, and 100-fold. And so that's the parable of the sower.
I have a question, Matt.
Yeah, absolutely.
So maybe I'm remembering the wrong gospel, but what happened to upon this rock I will build my church? I thought that was Peter.
That is Peter, but that's Matthew. That's the Peter of Matthew's gospel.
Okay.
So, and yeah, and so there are minor differences and kind of insignificant differences. So when Matthew gets a hold of when Luke gets a hold of this gospel, he's got to invert the numbers. So the good grain is going to magnify 160 and 30-fold. Like, okay, dealer's choice, I guess. But yeah, the Peter in Matthew's gospel is generally, but not always, a good figure. The Peter of Mark's gospel is with one exception, a continual failure. But what I will pause, because I know it sounds like I'm beating up on Peter. Remember, Mark is Peter's helper. So when Peter is telling Mark what happened, he is giving him the completely unvarnished absolute truth. He doesn't say, hey, make me look good, kid. He says, I failed. Show everybody how I failed. Show people how I didn't understand, right? Because the book of John, as well as other Christian traditions, affirm that Peter died being crucified. Peter was martyred. Peter found a way to not only be reconciled within the Christian community for what he had done, but he ultimately gives his life in service that his witness might bear fruit. Where he once kind of fell away due to persecution, later in life he faces it bravely and head on. So when I say that Peter was adult, I'm doing it with absolute admiration, because he could have told Mark, make me look good. I'm Jesus' favorite disciple. He did none of that. I mean, I would say warts and all, but it isn't even warts and all. It's like, just show me just warts. It really is like, we cannot commend Peter enough for not magnifying himself in a way that wasn't honest. So, were there any other questions about the parable of the sower? How does that feel as a theory for explaining the rest of the gospel? Do you think that it offers an accurate key to the different types of reaction that Jesus will get within the Gospel of Mark? Or does it make more sense just describing the life of the church after the events of the gospel? A thinker, totally fine. Okay.
I wonder what the parable means with regards to the idea of predestination.
This has been this is the third time today we've talked about predestination, and I'm going to admit for the crowds, I am not a Calvinist. Say more about that question, David.
Well, the seed is freely available to all four of the recipients, but it's clear that it will only germinate in one type of recipient. So is Mark telling us that certain people are just predestined not to accept and benefit from the gospel?
I don't know if Mark ever gives us a definitive pronouncement that would help us make that decision. I think the fact that Peter moves from being one class of soil in the timeline of the gospel and is able to kind of amend his soil during his lifetime, perhaps makes it a little bit more open-ended, that because the word is so freely given that there's more than one invitation to respond positively. But I don't know if that's Mark's chief concern with explaining this parable. I think that's a problem that theologians make up after the fact.
That happens a lot.
It's a choice, isn't it? The people making a choice.
Yeah, I mean, for most, they're making a choice. The explanation explicitly says that the seed thrown on the road, it's stolen from them, right? So it's not always an active personal choice. Sometimes the spiritual dimension does play a role, but yeah. Midge, thanks for raising your hand.
I kind of get it to be, you can't be a half-assed believer. If you're going to believe, you got to believe with all of you. You can't do, partially. You can't be a partial believer because then it's like going into the thorns or going into the shallow roots. You got to give in depth and you got to give all of yourself.
To quote my favorite baseball announcing crew for the Giants, you got to put both cheeks into that one
Yeah,
to get
right.
that. So absolutely. Perfect. So I mentioned earlier that perhaps, and I say perhaps because I can't prove it. Maybe the crowds that had been following Jesus to this point have been doing it for the wrong reason. And I think there are two features of Mark's gospel which are crucial to understanding the importance of Jesus to Mark and to Mark's community. And I mentioned I mentioned both of these in that little introductory letter to the Gospel of Mark. One is the middle section of Mark, and the second is the Messianic secret. So the middle section of Mark, it's hard in Mark to find a kind of definitive internal structure. So when we, so tomorrow you're going to get my introduction to the Gospel of Matthew, and that is divided nearly perfectly into 5 sections of Jesus having a major teaching episode, and then a major teaching section and some episodes that follow. Mark, it's very hard to do that. But I said earlier that the first half of Mark, so chapters 1 through 7, demonstrates one thing and one thing only, that Jesus has authority and power. And as I said, the crowds respond to it positively. He calls disciples, the crowds surround him wherever he goes. But do they understand who Jesus is? And so in Mark's gospel, in the middle, there are 2 stories of Jesus healing blind men. And between these bookends is, I think, the central argument of Mark's thesis as to who Jesus was. And the first miracle absolutely demands our attention, because Mark has spent the first half of his gospel demonstrating exactly how powerful Jesus is. But in chapter 8, we have the only miracle story in any of the 4 gospels where Jesus needs 2 takes to get a miracle right. So is this an episode of Jesus's miraculous power short-circuiting? I think that's doubtful given the first 7 chapters. I think this 2-stage miracle is a clue to us that something important is happening and is about to happen. So the miracle in chapter 8 reads like this. They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man to him and begged him to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had put saliva on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, "Can you see anything?" And the man looked up and said, I can see people, but they look like trees walking. And then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again and looked intently, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And he sent him away to his home, saying, "Do not go even into the village." So I'm going to put a pin right on that because that's another example of this messianic secret that we're going to talk about in a bit. So Jesus gives the blind man vision to see, but at first it's imperfect. To him, he sees people, but they look like trees walking. And what immediately follows this story? Well, it's the story of rocky soil springing up joyfully and withering upon kind of persecution. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answered him, "John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." And he asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter, the rock, answered him, "You are the Messiah." And he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said all of this quite openly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." And he called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If anyone want to become my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it." And so what I want to suggest tonight is that so far people can see the Messiah. They see this person of power, this miracle worker, this incredible teacher, but their vision of what messiahship means is cloudy. It is if people appear as trees walking. And the disciples make this mistake as much as anybody else, right? And so Jesus is, in the next 3 chapters, going to predict his suffering and death 3 times. After the transfiguration, which happens in chapter 10, Mark tells us Jesus was teaching his disciples, saying to them, "The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him, and 3 days after being killed, he will rise again." But they did not understand what he was saying, and they were afraid to ask him. They see Messiah, but a suffering Messiah doesn't make sense. The last time Jesus predicts his own death, he says this. This is Mark, excuse me. They were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. They were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. He took the 12 aside again and began to tell them what was to happen to him, saying, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death. Then they will hand him over to the Gentiles. They will mock him and spit upon him and flog him and kill him. And after 3 days, he will rise again." Now, responding to Jesus, James and John, the son of Zebedee, came forward to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What is it that you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit, one at your right and one at your left, in your glory." So here, I mean, at least James and John are complete dolts. He's saying, we're going to Jerusalem, and we're going to Jerusalem where I'm going to be not just killed, but mocked, spit upon, flogged, and then killed. And James and John say, "Hey, Jesus, we love being your friend. It's great being getting to hang out with the Son of God. Can we sit next to you in places of glory?" They see Jesus as Messiah, but they don't understand that Messiah means suffering. They see Messiahship as being all about power and authority. And Jesus is continually insistent that Messiahship is actually about suffering, service, suffering, and death. And so James and John, I think, demonstrate that the disciples obviously do not see Jesus for what he really is. They are asking about glory. They're not asking for advice on how to withstand trial and persecution. And so, as fellow followers of Jesus, we have to ask ourselves, how clear is our vision? How well do we see Jesus? Do we understand that the Messiah is meant for suffering and not for glory? How often do we assume that our life as Christians is going to be made easier, not harder, by the fact that we have been given the gift of grace? And so after these 3 predictions of his suffering and death, we come across a man named Bartimaeus. Now, immediately, our spider senses start to tingle because named recipients of miracles are few and far between. So to have a named recipient of a miracle is something really astonishing. But this blind man, ironically, and again, I want to just give Mark some credit. He is a gifted writer, and he's able, I think this irony is intentional. This blind man seems to see Jesus for who he is. He calls out, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And after receiving his vision, this former blind man, Bartimaeus, follows Jesus. The seed is planted, but what kind of soil was Bartimaeus? It's a great question. There's some fun theories that say that later on, when Jesus is arrested, there's a fellow in the Garden of Gethsemane who runs out of his clothes. He's so terrified of the Roman or of the police. Some people think that that's Bartimaeus. I'm not sure. But somehow Bartimaeus is able to kind of clearly see who Jesus is. Any questions on that middle section? Does that kind of help us understand both what Jesus is trying to prepare his disciples for and also the disciples' inability to understand what's coming down the pike? Yeah, Karen.
I'm not exactly sure if it's in the middle, but I was a little confused and I wasn't sure of the relevance of the short story of the disciples telling Jesus that they saw a man healing. I don't know if it was a healing or casting out demons, and he isn't one of us.
Right. Can I put a pin in that and we'll come back to after class? That'd be great. Yeah.
Okay.
Barry puts in the chat, I think the theory makes sense. The middle part of Mark addresses the idea that the apostles didn't really yet understand who Jesus really is. Yep, absolutely. But yeah, it sounds like I'm dunking on the disciples tonight. And maybe it's time to give them a moment of grace. Because when he heard that Jesus of Nazareth was walking outside of the streets of Jericho, he starts shouting, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And many sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And I hope you notice that this is not the first time that when people make reference to Jesus's identity, especially in the kind of theo-political realm of a title like Son of David, someone who has a claim to the throne of David, which represents both earthly and theological power, that when Jesus' identity is being disclosed, people often are told to keep quiet. And it's something called the Messianic secret, and it's a theory that was presented by William Reed right at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. So about 1904, I think William Reed is reading Mark and saying, "Why does Jesus always ask people to be quiet?" And it begins immediately. So I said earlier, Jesus' first miracle in the Gospel of Mark is an exorcism. It certainly would make weddings more entertaining if we use that instead of John's first miracle, right? So that at this exorcism, the demons recognize Jesus. They say, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are. You are the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And this request to be silent comes up again and again. So you hear instances like this. Warning them sternly, he dismissed him at once. Then he said to him, "See that you tell no one anything, but go show yourself to the priest and offer for your cleansing what Moses prescribed. That will be proof for them." The man went away and began to publicize the whole matter. He spread the report abroad so that it was impossible for Jesus to open a town openly. this is the Gerasene demoniac. He remained outside in deserted places, and people kept coming to him from everywhere. And he asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter said to him in reply, "You are the Messiah." And he warned them not to tell anyone about him. So that's kind of a Reader's Digest run through of all these times that Jesus wants to keep his secret, his identity a secret. And my question is, why would this resonate with Mark's community? It could be that all of these theories are connected, that the crowd see Jesus as power, and they assume that he will wield it to create political power, to overthrow the Roman occupiers of Palestine. And the crowds are getting in on the ground floor of this political revolution. But Jesus also knew that the crowds would shrink, that the seeds would wither or be choked by the cares of the world. But more than that, Jesus knew we were not seeing his messiahship clearly either. We understand what it means to be a Messiah as if we were seeing trees walking. And so part of Jesus's insistence of keeping his identity a secret is because Jesus's identity cannot be understood outside of the suffering and death of the Messiah. And that takes us to the absolute crescendo of Mark's gospel, which is the Passion. One of the things I've mentioned a few times, that Mark uses irony, I think, more deftly than any of the other gospel writers. One of the great moments of irony is that the goon squad, I guess is the best way to call it, of the chief priests, they began to spit on him, to blindfold him, and to strike him, saying to him, "Prophesy." Right? What did Jesus 2 chapters earlier say would happen when he gets to Jerusalem? Right? That he's going to be struck, that people are going to spit on him. They're mocking Jesus, saying, "Prophesy, what is going to happen to you," while they are literally living out Jesus's own prophecy as to how he'll be treated in Jerusalem. Simon becomes Rocky, right? He lives into his name. He denies Jesus 3 times. But the ultimate moment of Mark's gospel is Jesus's death. So let me read that account to you. When it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And then some of the bystanders heard it, and they said, "Listen, he's calling for Elijah." And someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a stick, and gave it to him to drink, saying, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down." Then Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain of the temple was torn in 2 from top to bottom. Now, when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly, this man was God's son." The bell curve of Jesus's followers is complete. Right? Starts at 0. We have this exponential growth as Jesus demonstrates his power. But as the messiahship, the nature of Jesus' messiahship is brought into sharper and sharper focus, as his messiahship is more about suffering than it is about wielding political power. His followers, for either being rocky soil or being choked up by the cares of the world, Jesus's followers abandon him. More than that, Jesus feels abandoned by God. But seeing the way in which Jesus died, seeing perfectly that the Messiah was meant for suffering and death, a Roman soldier. And think about what this would mean for Mark's community, having been persecuted and maybe having some of their friends executed by Roman soldiers. Into a Roman soldier's mouth comes the confession, truly this was God's son. Now, if Jesus was alive, this would normally be where a call for silence would come in, right? But as Jesus is dead at this moment, the proclamation by the Roman soldier is left echoing through the streets of Jerusalem. Not only was this God's son, but this is what it means to be God's son, to endure suffering and to endure death. It is no longer a secret who Jesus is. The way in which Jesus died proves that this was God's son. So the temple, Mark talks about the curtain, which, kind of protects mortals from the presence of God in the temple. It's torn from top to bottom, right? Indicating that this was divine action. The presence of God by the rending of the temple veil is not, we move the location of God not in the temple in Jerusalem, but to the cross, to the suffering of Jesus. That is the moment in which the messianic secret is revealed. Now, if that wasn't grim enough, Mark is going to double down on this apparent failure, right? There's a few faithful women, and we will give our cadre of women full credit. They're the only ones whose faith actually allows or motivates them to see this thing through. But even the women provide a kind of add insult to injury, doubling down on the apparent failure. What happens when Easter Sunday arrives? These women who are going to anoint Jesus's body, they're greeted by an angel who tells them affirmatively, you are looking for Jesus of Nazareth. He is not here. He has been raised. But what do they do with the news of Jesus' resurrection? This is how Mark's gospel ends. So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Now, I know your Bibles have extra verses after chapter 16, verse 8. That there's another ending of Mark, and then there's a shorter ending of Mark. I unequivocally believe that those were not written by Mark, that those were written afterwards, because Mark's gospel just doesn't make sense. We literally don't get to see Jesus, the risen Christ, on Easter. And so they're going to add in some epilogues like, oh yeah, and they saw Jesus, and Jesus, gave him a pat on the back, and, But I use the word apparent failure quite intentionally, right? Mark's gospel is a story about failure, a failure to understand who Jesus is. The crowds don't get it. The disciples don't get it. The women don't tell anybody about Easter. But we've run ourselves into not a paradox, but at least a logic problem that needs to be solved. How did Mark write his gospel? How did Peter become a martyr, right? What Mark's gospel, where it ends in mystery, logic allows us to kind of fill in the blanks. the women initially failed, right? For terror and amazement had seized them, and they said no one to any, or so told anything to no one. But eventually, the women got up the courage and started spreading the news that Jesus had been risen from the dead. Eventually, this group of failures, whether it's the women or whether it's the disciples or whether it's the crowd, they eventually, in light of the cross and in light of Easter Sunday, finally understand who Jesus was. And when we see Jesus as a suffering Messiah, as someone who had great power, but used it not to create his own kind of theopolitical realm, overthrowing the Romans, but instead, by the power of God, was able to kind of subsume Roman interests to survive death by faith. The followers of Christ are given access and draw upon a power which cannot be stopped even by persecution. But more than that, I think Mark's gospel is a kind of ever deepening kind of spring, that's the wrong word. It's drawing us deeper and deeper into tighter and tighter circles around our understanding of who Jesus is. The angel who greets the women at the tomb says this, "Go, tell the disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." This direction operates, I think, on two levels. It operates obviously on the geographic level, right? Go find the risen Jesus. And once you see and understand the identity of Jesus, then we're off to the races. But it is also an invitation to go back to the start of the Gospel of Mark. It's an invitation to go back to the events of Galilee at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. It's an invitation to be drawn deeper and deeper into the understanding of who Jesus was. To now understand the story from start to finish with a clear-eyed understanding of who Jesus is. To now understand that suffering and death is not the end of the story, that failure, that rejection, that abandonment, that all of those things, which having kind of survived the trauma, and really, it's not past tense, surviving the trauma, that the remnant of the church in Rome surely felt. What Mark's gospel kind of proves is that God is bigger than those things. That God can work through failure, through rejection, through abandonment. You feel abandoned? Jesus felt abandoned. How did we get through it together? Faith in God, right? That is, I think, what the Gospel of Mark, the portrait of Jesus that Mark offers us. It's a understanding that Jesus came with great power, but he used that power, sublimated it to demonstrate that suffering is not the end of the world, that with God we can get through suffering, that there is meaning to be found here, and that we are not alone in our suffering. I think that was a message that was comforting to the church in Rome as they were living through this persecution. And it's the gospel that allows us to kind of walk through troubling times, knowing that Jesus himself experienced exactly those things. So that is the portrait of Jesus we find in the Gospel of Mark. And so noting the time, I just want to say thank you all for your time and attention. I just so appreciate the gift of your time. It's a wonderful gift to be given. So I just wanted you to know I appreciate it. Were there questions that you had either about tonight's presentation or about the Gospel of Mark in general? Before I get to those questions, just a quick housekeeping note. So tomorrow you'll be emailed the signposts, what to look for in the Gospel of Matthew. And you're invited to read the Gospel of Matthew before our session. If you don't, still come to class. You can hopefully still get something out of it. But if you do read the Gospel of Matthew, you'll hopefully see and recognize some of the things we're talking about. So, if you would like to go, if you need to go, I want to honor your time. But I'm going to hang out and answer questions for the next 15-20 minutes, however long it takes. So thank you so much. And if you've got a question, I'd love to hear them.
I have a quick
Matt,
question.
I just want to say thank you. I think that was an excellent explanation of a gospel that doesn't really tell us the story in the way that we're used to listening to the stories of Christ. So thank you.
Matt, do you have our email? We didn't get your notes from the last week's.
I will check. Let me. I will check on that. Which email did you use?
We only have one.
LRJPHOY@hotmail.com.
I will. Don't sign off just yet. Let me log into Google and I'll check real quick. But I'm halfway decent at multitasking. So I saw Peggy had a hand.
Yeah, I have a quick question. Well, first of all, thank you so much. That was super fascinating. I really enjoyed all of that. Why the thieves on the cross? In Luke, the one thief says, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." Why does Mark not include that? He just says that both of the thieves, those who were crucified with him, also taunted him.
Yeah, so this so a couple of things. So one, that's a great illustration of obviously the diversity of the Gospels, right? And it's also a place, it's a context in which we cannot say that it happened more than once, right? That, Jesus wasn't crucified more than once. And so when there are differences, we need to kind of come up with a framework of understanding why there are differences. So what we'll see next week is with the exception of Matthew adding the detail that at the moment of Jesus's death, there are a number of resurrections that happen in and around the city of Jerusalem, and people appear to their families. Mark is nearly a verbatim copy, Matthew is a nearly verbatim copy of the Gospel of Mark. And so in both Mark and in both Matthew, the cross is a place of shame and suffering. Now Luke, to preview 2 weeks from now, Luke begins his gospel, most dear Theophilus. Many have tried to set out an orderly account of Jesus Christ, and I can't remember it verbatim, but here is my account. I'm going to suggest what Luke was trying to do is that Judaism was given a special exemption from having to worship the emperor god of Rome. And so what I think Luke is trying to do is to show a Roman official that Christians should be likewise exempted from having to pay taxes to the emperor. Now, how does that at all begin to answer your question, Peggy? What Luke is going to try to do is to try and make Rome's, it's going to try to make Rome look less bad at the resurrection, at the crucifixion. So Jesus is going to excuse the Roman soldiers. Lord, forgive them, they know not what they do, right? Luke is going to show that the Romans, they were basically bullied by the Jewish leaders. And so, because he has a reason to show that, he wants to show that Christianity is not a mortal threat to the Roman Empire. Luke also diverges from Matthew and Mark because he believes that the cross is hopeful, that there is something happening on Good Friday that is meant to give us comfort. And so when there is the repentant thief says, we are justly condemned to die. So it's pretty easy to assume he has done some sinful things. But even doing sinful things that get you condemned to death is not enough to be abandoned from the love of God. And Jesus says, truly, you will be with me this day in paradise. So what we have is kind of the earliest understanding of the cross was that it was a place of shame and suffering. Luke kind of moves the needle a little bit to it is a place, crucifixion was not an easy business, but it was all part of God's plan, and God's plan is to take care of us. By the end of the first century, by the time we get to the Gospel of John, the cross is a place of glory. Jesus is equating being lifted up on the cross with being lifted up so that he can, through the outstretched arms of the cross, embrace the whole world, right? And so we're always going to talk about the moment of Jesus's death, because it is a crucial moment to understanding who Jesus is. The other, we talked about trying to make Rome look less bad. The soldier at the foot of the cross says something completely different in Luke's gospel. At Luke's gospel, the Roman soldier says, truly, this man was innocent, right? So Jesus not only forgives the Romans for, crucifying him, forgive them, they know not what they do, but the Roman soldier says, this guy was innocent. We got bullied into this. We didn't mean to kill him. So yeah, what Jesus says on the cross is going to differ from gospel to gospel. We won't see a lot of difference next week in Matthew, but we're going to move the needle towards a radically different understanding of the meaning of the cross by the time we get to Luke and John. So how is that for a too long answer?
Good.
What was the question?
Excellent, thank you.
What was the question? That's how long that answer was. Yeah. The question was something related to why did Mark omit the story of Jesus forgiving the repentant thief who was crucified with him? So,
Matt,
Thank
I
you.
also noticed that Mark talks twice about feeding the crowd.
yes,
It
the
isn't
feeding of
just
the
it
5,000.
isn't just the 5,000, but then he talks about another time when he fed 4,000.
Yes.
And I
Well,
don't remember reading that in any of the other gospels. Is it in the other gospels? The 4,000?
I think there are 2 feeding stories in Matthew
Okay.
as well. Yeah, and that becomes another opportunity for seeing the doltishness of the disciples, right? Because Jesus has fed the 5,000, and just so we're all clear, it was more than that. Mark says Jesus fed 5,000 men, and there were women and
Right,
children.
because women and children don't count.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's just assume it's double that, right? Let's assume Jesus fed 10,000 people. Jesus feeds 10,000 people with 2 loaves of bread. They come to another deserted place. There's a giant crowd, and the disciples go, God, I wish we had a way to feed all of these people. Jesus, do you have any ideas of how we can feed all of these people? I don't think we can do it. We got to just send them home hungry. And, Jesus just goes, I need a new line of work. I'm
Yeah.
regretting some life decisions. It's an opportunity both to demonstrate the disciples don't get who Jesus is, and just remind us of the power that Jesus has, the miraculous power that Jesus possesses. And I'm trying to think if there's other. I think there's just the feeding of the 5,000. Yeah, but it's I think it's repeated in Matthew twice. I think Matthew retains that. Luke gets rid of it. He doesn't need it.
Oh my God.
Larry, you raised your hand on the app.
I did. So I didn't quite
What are we looking at?
understand if Mark, at the end of Jesus's life, was he content with what he wrote? Was he disappointed in Jesus's life? Was he, or did he just put out the word as in the gospel, just said what he saw or heard? He didn't seem to express any emotion or what was really happening.
No, I think Mark sees clearly who Jesus is, or at least sees a facet of Jesus's identity clearly. His gospel starts with, this is the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. It's several people tonight have kind of talked about Mark as a journalist, or as kind of a dragnet, just the facts ma'am kind of author. I guess that description doesn't resonate with me, because I think when I read Mark, I read this fascinating tale of mystery and intrigue and wonder. And so we all have our own opinions about the different gospels, but
Study references.
I think Mark not only is proud of his work, but thinks that his work is going to help other people see and understand why Jesus is important. That is perhaps his motivation for writing in the first place, is, hey, we got to have it's fun to tell the stories around, a campfire every now and then, but people have got to learn all the things Jesus did, and that there's something important about having all of these stories together and tying them in a way that is both has fidelity to the history and to the eyewitnesses' accounts that he's hearing, but also crafted in a really artful way that shows drama, irony. I hope Mark is proud of it. If not, I'm proud of it. So
I'm proud, but I just
yeah. Mike, I saw you raise your hand.
Yes, I remember a believer who was a police detective who related how when they're deciding what is true, what really happened from numerous witnesses of a crime scene, he said there's there's different variations. Everyone has sort of a different angle. Some of them saw different things that others didn't see, but when they put it all together, they can really see what happened. And he said that when he reads the Gospels, it's just like that.
Yeah.
Different,
and what's funny, because in seminary
like the different numbers at the feeding of the 5,000 to the 7,000, those kind of variations will happen, and other little differences. But because people forget things. Maybe Bartimaeus is only remembered because after 30 years, you don't remember everyone's name.
Yeah, well, and yeah, I think that's certainly true. I mean, we are kind of, and Luke is going to say this explicitly. Luke is going to recognize other people have written gospels. I'm going to write an orderly account, right? So Luke is telling us he's going to do some redacting. He's going to put things in a way that it makes more sense. And, so if we look at like the events of Holy Week, Jesus curses a fig tree, right? He's walking in and out of Jerusalem. And he wants a snack. Fig tree's barren or doesn't have any figs on it, so he curses it, right? In one gospel, I think it's Mark, Jesus goes out and then comes back in a day or two and the tree is dead. In the Gospel of Matthew, that tree instantly dies and withers away. Does our salvation hinge on how quickly the tree died? Is it possible that eyewitnesses say like, oh yeah, the tree died right then and there, and then somebody else says, well, I'm not sure if the tree died, but by the time Jesus came back that way, like the tree was definitely dead. Like the tree is dead, Jesus cursed it. There seems to be some correlation and causation there. So, there are eyewitness accounts. The other thing about eyewitness accounts, in seminary, when we're trying to learn strategies for pastoral care, there are different ways in which the truth is expressed. So that the way a witness talks about an assault is different than how a victim will describe that same thing, right? Like, when we're talking about the victims of assault and kind of describing their experience, it's very circular, right? It's not a narrative, and it'll often kind of come back to this one thought or this one image, like it was the street light, reflecting. I could see the street light reflected in the knife that he had, right? And just coming back to the knife and everything is, just back to, that it's much how somebody else will tell the story is going to be different based on where they were in the story as well. So yeah, absolutely.
So, what was the point of killing the fig tree? I never really did understand that. He was mad at the fig tree because it didn't have any fruit. No, I'm being facetious. I don't mean that.
No, so on Sunday I preached about that. The thing we often forget about is Jesus was human, and it is possible for Jesus to have a crummy day. And this is why I have not been imbued with the powers of the divine creator of heaven and earth, is I would probably abuse it when it comes to getting my way. Like I really wanted some chicken wings for dinner tonight, didn't want to cook. And the Safeway in Quincy is like completely sold out. I think the fryer failed or something. Like,
oh,
when I wanted a snack, like if I had the power of the creator of heaven and earth, like, yeah, I would get that dinner. And if I didn't, I'd be pretty cross and upset. So
I'm glad he wasn't at drive-through.
Yeah. So, but it's okay to admit that Jesus got angry every now and then. It's all right.
So I have one last question.
Yeah.
This will come up in the other sessions, but these multitude of crowds, that corroborated in the other Gospels?
There are times in which Jesus is speaking to crowds, and I think the crowd is a little bit more omnipresent, not to suggest that it's the same, maybe another good analogy would be like Tiger Woods at a golf tournament, right? There are crowds that follow Tiger around from the first hole to the 18th hole, right? There are also people that just sit on the 16th green, and the players coming from, oh, and they get to see him there. I get the sense that Jesus, the followers of Jesus, were kind of like that. There were some people, when Jesus is on his preaching tour, they came out and heard what he had to say. Other people maybe followed him around. It's hard to know. So yeah, but the crowds are not as omnipresent in the other gospels, is perhaps a good way to say it.
Thank you.
Thank you all for your questions. I appreciate it. Well,
Thank you.
any others? No. All right. Well, have a great night, everybody, and we'll look for an email from me tomorrow, and we'll see you next Wednesday night.
Sure.
And I sent you our email address through text.
Yeah, I'm going to look through the chat and add some of those. So thank you.
And night.